Okay, so in the previous video, we've explored the rationale for the scientific methodology. And we've also mentioned that there's some areas in science that have a higher degree of confidence, while others haven't been well enough tested yet or well enough understood to have that same level of confidence. Now, when it comes to the theory of evolution, because now we're kind of zeroing in on this topic, the question is what areas of the theory of evolution have are less well established or less well understood. And I wanted to come back to this chart that we had earlier on in the presentations and think about how several of these positions will impact the fossil record if they were true. So because I think the fossil record is not, or just paleontology in general, it's not the area necessarily that needs to be studied or evaluated in this matter as much as some of the biological issues, and we'll get to that in a minute. But if we were thinking about the fossil record, there's several dispositions that would look identical or more or less the same in the fossil record. So obviously, naturalistic evolution, scientists already believe that that paradigm harmonizes well with the fossil record. If we go further to the right, evolutionary creationism, there's no tangible difference between this option and naturalistic evolution, because even though these people believe in God, they don't believe God interfered with the naturalistic process of evolution in any way. So from a practical perspective, there's no real difference here. So there wouldn't be any difference in the fossil record. Theistic evolution also wouldn't really have much of a difference because, again, this position is more of somebody trying to adapt their theology to evolution. So they more or less would say, hey, things look exactly the way scientists think it looks, but God was the one guiding it behind the scenes. There's no way to recognize that guidance. It's just there, and we just believe it to be there. So basically, essentially, under this paradigm, the fossil record will look the same. But then even this other group here, intelligent design, there's some versions of intelligent design that would be compatible with a fossil record, because, you know, if at some point in the distant past, God stepped in and maybe introduced some additional biological complexity, unless there was a massive jump all at once, it wouldn't really affect the fossil record, because the fossil record will still show that certain animals existed at a certain period in time. So even with intelligent design, things would look more or less the same. Okay, so then the fossil record is compatible with naturalistic evolution, theistic evolution, or interventionism, which is the intelligent design paradigm. So because the fossil record doesn't really affect things as much, the area that I think needs to be focused on more is the area of biology and genetics. But then even here, the majority of this doesn't need to be brought into question, because it's more or less straightforward. So for example, the fact that there's genetic diversity within population of organisms. Yes, that diversity is there, and it's clear that it's there. The fact that natural selection can work on genetic diversity to bring about change, that is also a straightforward claim that doesn't need to be proven or tested or questioned. The idea that natural mutations occur and that sometimes they can contribute towards positive change, I think that's also more or less straightforward. We don't really need to question it. The one idea that does need to be studied or evaluated further, I think, is the idea of complex mechanisms. And I'll explain what I mean in a second by that. There is one thing I think we always need to clarify here and explain, that the contribution of novel mutations is a mechanism that's different than what we have prior to this by just natural selection acting on genetic diversity. Because sometimes people try to merge those together and make it seem as if it's one seamless process, when in fact it's something different. So just to give an analogy here, let's say I have a bag of letters, and I have these letters here. I have the letters A through G. I can mix these letters up and pull them out randomly and create words. And there's a certain amount of words I can make. So for example, the word bag here would be one option. The word age would be another option. But the word man, for example, wouldn't be an option with this particular collection of words. So all the variation of possible words that I can come up with this, or let's just say there is a certain collection of words, of dictionary words that I can come up with by just randomly working with this particular collection of letters. But now let's imagine that I take the letter D and I break it in half. So I cut it down the middle here. If I do that, half of it will look like a C if I flip it around. And I already have C's in this collection of letters, so it wouldn't really mean anything. But the other half will look like an I. And an I is a completely new letter that I didn't have in this collection before. So now there's an entirely new set of words that I can create using this new letter that has been introduced through a mutation. So I just want to clarify that there's a difference between natural selection working on genetic variation that already exists and the genetic variation that is created by novel mutations. And the reason for this is because sometimes people use examples like, for example, different breeds of dogs. We can take different breeds of dogs and through artificial selection, really tamper around with them and come up with all kinds of interesting looking versions of dogs. But that is more like, the first process here where we're just working on the genetic variation that already exists. Whereas coming up with novel mutations is a somewhat different process, and for it to accumulate over time, it would take a lot longer than the previous process. Anyway, that's just something that everybody's aware of, that understands biology, but a lot of times when this material is kind of presented to people that don't have a background in biology, the two processes are merged together as if they flow seamlessly together. They're one and the same process, when in fact things are slightly different. Mutations are slightly different than working with existing genetic variation. Okay, so then none of these things I think need to really be questioned or brought up to evaluate further, because they're more or less straightforward, and we can accept that they happen. The one area that is still, I think, still needs to be under consideration is the idea of complex mechanisms or biological machines, as they have sometimes been called. For example, the human eye and a few other things. This topic has been discussed at length over the past 30 years or so because of someone named Michael Behe, who's a microbiologist, professor at some university. And he came up with this phrase, the phrase irreducible complexity. And I want to spend a little bit of time going back over this history, because I think it's had an impact on the discussion, and maybe not the most positive impact. I think it's actually set things back a bit. So Michael Behe wrote a book in 1996 called Darwin's Black Box. And in this book, he more or less took an old argument, which is, kind of similar to the old watchmaker argument, kind of like if you put a bomb in a watchmaking factory, you wouldn't expect the pieces to fly out and come together into a functioning watch. That's highly improbable. And, that's not the kind of thing that you would expect to happen. So because of that, you wouldn't expect evolution to actually work. So Michael Behe took kind of a similar argument. He said, look, imagine this mousetrap. The mousetrap has a specific function. The whole purpose of it is to catch mice. But to catch mice, it has several components. It has this block of wood that is the base. Then it has a spring, and then it has a hammer that comes down on the mouse, and then it has some kind of trigger, and it has a latch that lets the hammer loose whenever the mouse steps on the trigger. And you have to have all these components in place for this to perform its function. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. So in a sense, it's irreducibly complex. You can't take pieces apart to make the mouse work. And because of that, this is not the kind of thing you would expect to evolve over time, where you have one piece and then natural selection helps you to add another piece and another piece, and eventually you get a complete mousetrap. And at every stage, you're catching more and more mice because the device is more and more effective with each stage. No, the device will have no efficiency at all. You'll be completely useless until all the pieces are in place. So it's hard to imagine how this stuff can evolve. Now, the thing to understand would be is that probably the major reason for why he became popular at this point in time is because of the very terminology he used. He used a phrase that was something of a gimmick, like it really caught people's attention. This mental construct that something can be irreducible, and because of that, it cannot be evolvable. And this has helped him sell a lot of books, and it has helped him get attention, and it raised some legitimate questions for scientists to think about and consider. But at the same time, it set him up for failure. And you know, from the moment he put out his book, and for over the next decade or two or whatever it was, so for like the whole decade after he published his book, there were a lot of critics of his idea, and a lot of people came up with different arguments against irreducible complexity. And then in 2005, there was a trial in Dover County, which was basically that some group of people decided that they wanted to provide an alternative to the teaching of evolution in public school. So in a certain set of public schools in a certain district. So they decided to put a sticker on the books saying, if you want an alternative explanation for the origins of life, go to the library and check out this book called, I think it was Of Pandas and People or something like that, which was a book that promoted intelligent design. Or to be more clear, it was a book that promoted creationism, and then somebody went back and removed the word creator and inserted the word intelligent design by like a copy and paste process. So that's more or less what happened, and people sued the district because they felt that was promoting religion in public schools. And then there was this trial where they invited people like Behe to testify, and the Discovery Institute and some other intelligent design outfits. They were invited to contribute to the trial. And Behe had a chance to be cross-examined for hours and hours. I mean, I've read this massive transcript of the trial that took me weeks to finish because it was so much. But this is back in the day when I used to hardly ever read. But anyway, throughout this trial, Behe was questioned and interrogated and so on. But one of the key things that came out in the trial is that a proponent of evolution, I believe his name was Kenneth Miller. I think he introduced this idea that even when it comes, because in fact one of the main examples that Behe was using was the flagellum of a bacteria. So a lot of bacteria have this little tail that kind of spins around, and if you look at it under microscope, the reason the tail spins around is that it has this kind of motor-looking thing that makes it able to spin its tail. And Behe was saying that motor is kind of irreducibly complex. But then Kenneth Miller came up and said, look, even the flagella has a component of its motor that used to be a type 2 secretory system, which was some kind of molecule that allowed the bacteria to pass some kind of substances in and out of the cell. So basically, they showed that even the textbook example, Behe's textbook example of irreducible complexity, and it had at least one reduction. And one reduction is all you need to demonstrate that something is not irreducible. Because there is one reduction to the thing. So that more or less deflated everybody that was kind of following along with this whole debate. And people kind of moved down from there, and they kind of gave up on the whole idea. There was another problem with Michael Behe, and mostly it was the fact that he was a microbiologist, and he felt that he didn't want to take a stand on something that was outside his area of expertise. So he mostly focused on micromolecules, on micro machines, because he wanted to work within his field. But the problem is that when you're looking at things at the microbiological level, you're mostly dealing with things that occur in populations of microorganisms like bacteria and things like that. And these have very large population numbers and have very high reproductive rates. So even when you're in a situation where, in order for some structure to evolve, you need many different mutations to happen, and maybe some component is irreducible in that you need all the things to occur at once before it works. The fact that there's so many individuals in a population, and the fact that they reproduce every half an hour, every hour, whatever. I mean, just by random chance, somebody might get lucky and come up with some complicated structure. But when it comes to macroorganisms, when it comes to things that are much more advanced than bacteria, all of a sudden you have there's a huge reduction in population size in which you're working with this variation, and the reproductive rates are way less than that. So you're moving from once every half hour to, once or twice every 50 years or whatever. So maybe I'm exaggerating there, but essentially there's a huge difference in what can happen in bacteria versus what can happen in higher organisms. So this is another challenge that BE has. So first, he used a term that was very catchy and got him a lot of attention. But the drawback was that he set himself up to fail, because all somebody had to do is show that there's one reduction to his one favorite example, and it just kind of deflated the whole thing, and everybody lost interest in what he had to say. And people basically set the whole thing up as if the burden of proof was on him. So basically, you're using this as an argument against evolution. Your argument is not compelling enough to disprove evolution, so therefore evolution stands. So essentially, for those kind of that have kind of followed this debate within the wider community, especially among Christians, I believe a lot of Christians that maybe sometime in the 90s or maybe even earlier had put faith in the intelligent design movement to be a solution to the problem that evolution was for Christianity. They when they saw the failures of this movement during this Dover trial and in other subsequent events, they gave up, and there was kind of a fairly wide shift within the evangelical community to where people kind of stopped fighting against evolution. They more or less embraced it. So I think this whole historical event had quite a bit of significance in terms of Christians deciding where they stand on the topic of evolution. And it had a lot to do with a poorly framed argument that seemed really nice. I mean, it was catchy, got a lot of attention. Everybody was talking everywhere about irreducible complexity, but overall it set things up for failure. So I want to go back and kind of rethink through this idea, but approach it in a much more sensible way, because I don't consider this an argument against evolution, but I do think that this is an area within the theory of evolution that is less well understood and less well confirmed as other areas within the theory of evolution. But I want to address one more element here, and it's this fact that people approach the whole debate from the perspective that there is a lack of alternatives to evolution, and that in itself is an evidence for evolution. So how does this work? Well, as we mentioned in the previous videos, people are already starting from a flawed philosophical foundation, because they approach things from this perspective of tentative naturalism, and that is their default state. They haven't been given any evidence to consider the possibility of the supernatural, so they're going to assume everything is natural, until some evidence for the supernatural is presented. Science itself follows methodological naturalism because, as I explained in the previous video, it doesn't really have a choice. So really, the only thing that qualifies as scientific is a naturalistic explanation. But we've tried a bunch of naturalistic explanations for the origins of living organisms, and they fail. Like over a century or so ago, there was a stage where people believed in Lamarckism, or I believe that's what it was called. It's been a while since I've studied this, but they believe that things, like if a giraffe keeps stretching and stretching its neck to reach a fruit, it's gonna like stretch over time and get passed on. Well, that they realize that things don't really work that way. So in other words, scientists have already tried all the other natural explanations, and all the others have failed, and evolution is the only one that we have that works. So if it's not a naturalistic explanation, it doesn't qualify as science, so those things can be dismissed. So because evolution is the only viable naturalistic option, and because irreducible complexity wasn't a strong enough argument against evolution, then evolution just basically stands because it hasn't been disproven, and it stands automatically, it stands as the default. But we already mentioned that this whole thing starts with a flat foundation because we don't actually know if going back to previous videos where I had the three hypotheses, the naturalistic hypothesis, the supernaturalistic hypothesis, and the God hypothesis, in the sense that you could have something that's supernatural but not God. You have those three hypotheses, and we don't know which one is the right one. And we can't know that ahead of time, and we have no basis for demonstrating which is the right one. And we cannot just dismiss those possibilities. So all these things kind of play in together into how people have approached this topic. So one way to kind of make this point, I don't know, it might be useful to somebody, but let's just imagine for a second that there was another naturalistic alternative to evolution, and scientists had two options to work with, not just one. So they said, like given any specific question, like did X evolve? Scientists would say, well, option one is that it did evolve. Option two is that it came about through the second alternative. Okay, let's just imagine there was this other alternative. The question is, given specific components of living organisms, like for example, the human eye, if scientists had two options, would they still be confident that this thing could have evolved? Or would they instinctively say, no, this is probably one of those things that came through this second alternative? So in other words, is the lack of an alternative a significant reason why people believe these things evolved, or is there actual evidence that they did evolve? So we're going to kind of work through that, just thinking about the idea of complex biological machines. Now, biological machines, and some people say, well, the terms are loaded already because you're using the word machines, and machines are things that men make. But we tend to lack the language to even discuss these things properly, because these things behave or appear like machines, and then we have to if somebody wants to prove that they're different, they have to demonstrate that these things are really different. So a machine is something that has multiple parts to perform a function. So for example, let's say I was stranded on a deserted island, and in the middle of this island there was a kind of a stream passing through, and I said to myself, okay, hey, this stream is here, maybe I can take advantage of the energy of the water flowing through to do some kind of work for me. So I built like a okay, I forgot what this thing is called, but essentially, like I can take an axle and then put a wheel on it and let the water fall on the wheel and spin the axle, and then use the spinning motion to do something for me, whether it's to press some grain and help make some flour, or whether it's to do something else, some kind of other device. But this machine, in order to utilize the force of the water, it has to have several components. It has to have some kind of base, it has to have an axle, and then it has to have some kind of water wheel that the water falls on and makes it spin and things like that. And then it has to have the component that is used to do what I actually needed to do. Anyway, machines have this thing where there's a specific function, and then there's multiple components that come together to perform that function. So the way I treat these things is not as an argument against evolution, but as a question that I think still is still in need of being developed, because it's not fully addressed, and chances are that we might not even have the tools to fully address it, and I don't know if we ever will, because it's a very complicated question. So one of the issues with biological machines is that it's not just how did they come into existence, but it's that they have to go through various stages, and it's a challenge at each stage of the, or each step of the way, not only at the beginning. So the reason it is a challenge is whenever we think about the idea of natural selection, the concept of natural selection is what made the theory of evolution possible. So before Darwin understood the idea of natural selection, there was no theory of evolution, because people just realized the level of complexity in living organisms, and just to assume that things evolved that complexity on their own just through random processes just didn't make sense. But natural selection came on the scene by saying, okay, if some change occurs in an existing level of genetic diversity, if some change occurs and that change is beneficial to a specific environment, then that change gets selected for and passed on to the next generation. So, one example, one way to think about this is, okay, let's say somebody flips a coin and they take a step forward, and if it's heads, and a step back if it's tails, right? Well, they could be sitting there flipping heads or tails for hours and hours, and they might move one way for a while, and then they might have to move the other way. So they probably wouldn't make any progress, because there's a 50-50 chance they'll get heads and 50-50 chance they'll get tails. But if for some reason, let's say they flipped the coin, and let's say there was some kind of selective process, like if they managed to get 5 heads in a row, then they got to start over from that location and go from there, or something like that. So there was something that's selective for a specific direction, then they would actually make progress. So on the one hand, you have random mutations, you have random variation, and then you have a selective process that's dependent on an environment, and you could actually have progress in the sense that organisms become more adaptive to that environment. But the idea is that as these mutations happen, as these changes occur within the genetic realm, that those produce some kind of advantage. The problem with machines, however, biological machines, is that you have all the multiple components that come together, and the question is, does the organism get some kind of advantage as these components are coming together? So in the process of them coming together, does the organism get an advantage? And if not, what is the selective force? What is driving this process forward? Is it just a matter of luck that multiple components have come together, and then they're actually performing a function, and then they get selected for it? Or is there like an advantage at every step of the way, even if you don't have the full components coming together? And not just this, but once you get to a certain stage, then you got to move to the next stage, and it's the same process again, because you don't know that every single step, every single mutation that happens after that is going to be beneficial. Maybe it's positive, some mutations are positive, some are neutral, and some are detrimental. So you're basically at stage 1, and you're trying to get to stage 2, but the mutations that you need to get from stage 1 to stage 2 are actually making this component less functional until you have all the mutations and you get to stage 2, and then it becomes more functional than stage 1. But to get from here to here, the advantage to the organism goes down for a bit before it goes back up. So that's a possibility there, and those are the kind of things that that need to be considered to see, to see how they work. So the only way we can really know that is if we have some kind of sense of the genetic pathway that something took to get from one stage to another. And some things are so complex that they have to go through many stages to get to the level they are at today. And we would have to kind of follow the genetic pathway and say, okay, this is stage one. These are the changes it needs to get to stage two. These are the kinds of mutations that need to happen. And some of these mutations are positive and they might give us some advantage. Other mutations are negative, but maybe it got lucky and it had those mutations done fairly close to each other, and the organism managed to survive long enough for all the mutations to happen. And then it got to stage two and so on. So all these different things would kind of have to be calculated for us to know whether these things actually developed in this way or not. And it would be very hard for us to calculate that, because something might have an advantage in more than one area. So you wouldn't give it an advantage for the specific function we're working towards, but maybe that mutation would be advantageous in some other way. And it's very hard to know what that would be. So essentially, a lot of times these things are kind of treated as overly simplistic. So, you ask, and when you have a conversation about evolution, you say, well, how did the eye evolve? You probably hear something like, okay, you start with a light sensitive cell, okay, and then that light sensitive cell kind of gets placed in within this kind of indented concave space, and then this space gets filled with water or some kind of fluid, and then it gets covered at the other end. And then you have a lens, some kind of material that develops as a lens, and then other things develop after that, and that's how you get to the modern eye. So it seems very simple, and it seems like it makes sense to go through these various stages. But then when you look at the actual eye, you got to realize that the human eye is extremely complex, because one way to think about it is the idea of a bionic eye. I mean, we've had heart transplants, we've done quite a bit of stuff in biology, in medicine. But when it comes to, why is it that we can't, if somebody has a bad eye, why is it that we can't replace it with a man-made eye and then just have them be able to see just the same? And the thing is that they're working on that, but it's just now, finally, like in the 21st century, after decades and decades of working at this, that we're finally getting advanced enough to come up with something that's complex enough to replace the human eye. So this is a fairly high level of complexity we're talking about. And this illustrations might help to convince people that it's possible, but they're very simplistic because they don't address the level of complexity that we're dealing with in the human eye. So somebody might say, well, even if we don't know how it evolved, we know it evolved because we could see all the stages within different organisms. In the, living organisms have eyes at all the different stages, which is fine. But the question is, how did they get from one stage to another? Was there some kind of advantage as, when you get from stage one to stage two, for example, what are the mutations that need to happen? Are all those mutations advantageous, or were some of them neutral? And if they're neutral, what's the driving force to move it forward? And is it possible that any of them were detrimental, so that way natural selection actually fights against the evolution of that particular thing? So all these things need to be kind of looked at and evaluated. So again, all these things are occurring at the genetic level, and we would have to kind of go from stage 0%, where there's 0% genetics for something, to 100% genetics for something, kind of follow the pathway all the way through. So, let's say if we're talking about the human eye, we would have to go back in evolutionary history, way back to the point where there's no trace of anything that represents a precursor to the eye, and start there, and then follow the genetic history all the way to the present and see what happened to get to where we are today. Again, there will be functional stages, because chances are not every single change that takes place is a change that really transforms the eye into something very different. So there's probably stages where things are, there's distinct stages, and then there's steps in between those stages. Um, so again, you might have situations where something might be working, but to get it to the next stage, you need to kind of deconstruct something and rebuild it to make it better. And in those situations, you have reverse natural selection. In other words, natural selection fights against the evolution of something because it was working better before you started deconstructing the thing. And I mentioned this earlier, that when you're working with microorganisms at the beginning of evolutionary history, some of this seem highly plausible because of high reproductive rates and large population size. I mean, you're dealing with billions of organisms on a square inch, But so just imagine how many there are on the whole planet. But the more advanced you get, the population size drop tremendously and the reproductive rates drop tremendously. So do we still have time within the fossil record for all these changes to take place that need to take place to get us from each stage in the evolution of these mechanisms? Now, somebody will say, well, the problem with what you're saying is that you're assuming a linear path. You start with nothing and then you get to die. But evolution doesn't have a direction in mind. It could go in many different directions. It just happened to come this way, which is fine, because just if things go in a certain direction, you might not know where they end up, but you could always kind of work your way backwards and see where they came from. And you can take into account other possible directions for something to move as well. But again, all these things, it seems like to really know if these things could work, could happen over time, you would actually have to trace the genetic pathway. Now, usually the eye is the go-to example for creationists on this, because it's clearly something extremely complex. I don't have the background in biology to know how many more such mechanisms exist and what level of complexity they're at. I'm assuming there's quite a bit, and at different levels of organization. So some might be more simple, some might be more complex, some might be at the molecular level, some might be at the organ level, and things like that. I'm assuming that there. I don't know enough about this to give examples, but the one example I think everybody can agree with is the human brain. And it's kind of hard to believe that somebody can confidently state that the human brain can evolve when they don't even know how consciousness works. At least with a bionic eye, at least with the human eye, we have examples of it, because we have cameras, and we have the human-made devices that have a similar working principle, and we're more or less at the stage where we're able to create complex enough bionic eyes that they could replace the human eye and have people being able to see. This is like a recent thing, probably the past 5 years or so. But when it comes to consciousness, we have not created a computer, for example, that can become self-aware and that has consciousness on the level that a human being has consciousness. We don't even know how consciousness works. So it's hard to believe that we can confidently say something like consciousness can evolve. Now, for people coming at this from the theist side, they would dismiss this question altogether because they believe in a soul. So they believe the soul is responsible for consciousness, but none of that matters within the scientific world, because science is supposed to be working on this naturalistic platform, which means it has to assume that consciousness is a function of the brain. So somehow the claim is that consciousness evolved, but we don't even know how consciousness works. So it's kind of hard to believe that we can say with confidence that this is something that definitely did evolve. We probably have to understand how it works and then follow the genetic pathway to see if it makes sense to claim that this highly complex biological computer went step by step all the way to the stage where it made it possible to have consciousness. And yes, I understand that there's less complex brains going all the way down to very simple organisms that have a very simplistic nervous system. But the question again is there a genetic pathway to get from each one of those stages to the next? Or are there situations where getting from one stage to the next is implausible because you have to deconstruct something to make it better? Just to kind of give another analogy, imagine you're in a bicycle race, and I think I have this on the next slide. No, never mind, I must have skipped it. Imagine you're in a bicycle race to get again from Los Angeles all the way to New York. And as you're in this race, you're allowed to rebuild your bicycle and to try to convert it into a motorized bicycle or into a motorcycle, so that way you can go faster and faster and win your race. But to do that, imagine you're doing this while you're racing. So you're riding your bike for a while, and while you're riding, maybe you're going to pull over for a bit so you could attach another component that maybe gives it a little bit more power. Then you put a motorized thing, and then you race some more, and now you're going even faster. But as you're doing this, there's probably situations where you're going to say, okay, for me to get to the next level here and make it even faster, I'm going to have to take some pieces out and put something better in their place. But the minute you do that, that means you're, at least for the time being, while you're working on this thing, and you can only make one change at a time, and you can only go to the next level at a time. I mean, you can't just jump from like a bicycle to a highly sophisticated motorcycle. Like, you have to do things in a certain order and one little change at a time. But there might be situations where you, in order to get to the next stage, you might have to take certain parts of the bike apart to make it capable of moving on to the next stage. But the minute you do that, you're going to lose out on the race, because your bike isn't, for the duration of time it takes you to rebuild it and to make it more functional, you're not going to be able to compete as well with everybody else, because your bike is kind of taken apart for the time being, you know? So all these things are legitimate questions that we would have to answer, but it seems extremely difficult to answer those questions, because probably the only way to do it is to, at some point, maybe to develop a very complex computer program that has some way to follow the genetic pathway, but also to run simulations of what that genetic pathway will have in the phenotype, in the real world, so to speak, like run simulations of what an organism would look like and how it would behave and what advantages and disadvantages it would have. And of course, we don't know the history of the organism to know exactly where it lived and what competition it had and what it was trying to accomplish. So it's this whole historical step-by-step process of trying to trace the evolution of something seems like an extremely difficult thing to do. But it seems to me that somebody would have to do this to really know with confidence that these things actually developed or evolved over time. So the point is that this is an area that I would say the theory of evolution is not as, doesn't have the same level of certainty as other components of the theory of evolution. So evolution is a theory that is made of many parts. Like I said before, some of them have a higher level of, we can have a higher level of confidence in. Some of them we're not quite there yet. So there's different degrees of confidence between different parts. Biological machines are an area that I think there's less certainty on, and we cannot have the same level of confidence there yet. And I'm not sure what it would take to have that to get us to that level of confidence. But because of how we think about these things and because of the nature of the scientific method, we kind of tend to be a little more confident than we should be on some of these areas. But because I think these things still need to be explored, this creates some space where there's a possibility of an alternative model. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next video, the possibility of scientists testing out other alternatives to evolution while we're still sorting out some of these areas that are not completely well understood.